The radio crackled to life in the humid Georgia morning. Unit 23, we have a confirmed sighting of the suspect vehicle heading southeast toward the Okefenokee Preserve boundaries. Officer Sarah Collins adjusted her tactical vest and glanced down at her partner. Max, a 6-year-old Belgian Malinois, sat perfectly still beside her, his dark eyes alert and focused. His black and tan coat gleamed under the early sunlight filtering through the patrol car's windshield. "Copy that. Dispatch." "Unit 23 responding," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. She'd been chasing this particular drug runner for 3 weeks. Marcus Gator Williams had earned his nickname not just for his swamp-dwelling habits, but for his ability to slip away from law enforcement like a reptile, disappearing into murky water. Sarah guided their cruiser down the narrow access road leading to the preserve's edge. Spanish moss draped from ancient cypress trees created an almost ethereal canopy overhead. The familiar scent of stagnant water and decomposing vegetation filled the air as they approached the marshland. "All right, Max," she said, stepping out of the vehicle. "Time to show them what Atlanta's finest K9 unit can do." Max's ears perked forward, his entire body language shifting into work mode. The playful dog from their morning routine had vanished, replaced by a focused, disciplined professional. Sarah attached his tactical harness, complete with a small camera and GPS tracker, then clipped the retractable leash to her belt. The suspect's abandoned Camaro sat at the end of the dirt trail, its engine still warm. Sarah approached cautiously, her hand resting on her service weapon. The driver's door hung open, and muddy footprints led directly into the swamp. "Max, search!" she commanded. The Malinois immediately dropped his nose to the ground, his powerful scent receptors processing hundreds of different odors. Within seconds, he'd isolated the target scent and began tracking, his tail straight and confident. They moved deeper into the preserve, following a barely visible trail through knee-high marsh grass. Sarah's boots squelched in the soft mud with each step, while Max navigated the terrain with natural grace. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the humid air into a suffocating blanket. "Unit 23, what's your position?" came the radio call. "Approximately half a mile into the preserve, tracking southeast," Sarah responded, never taking her eyes off Max's focused form ahead of her. The trail led them around a bend, where the landscape opened into a wider wetland area. Ancient cypress trees stood like sentinels in the dark water, their knobby roots creating a maze of hiding spots. This was Gator's territory, and Sarah knew he'd chosen this route deliberately. Max suddenly stopped, his head raised, ears forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not aggressive, but alert. Sarah immediately halted, trusting her partner's instincts completely. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Through the morning mist, she could barely make out a figure moving between the trees roughly 50 yards ahead. Marcus Williams, wearing a dirty white tank top and cargo shorts, was wading through the shallow water, clearly trying to put distance between himself and his pursuers. Sarah keyed her radio. "Suspect visual confirmed. We're moving to intercept." Max's muscles tensed beneath his harness, ready to spring into action at her command. The partnership they'd developed over 6 years had taught them to communicate without words. Sarah could read every twitch of his ears, every shift in his stance, just as Max had learned to anticipate her movements and commands. "Easy, Max," she breathed, studying the terrain ahead. "We do this smart." The swamp stretched before them, beautiful and dangerous, holding secrets in its murky depths. Neither Sarah nor Max realized that in just a few minutes, this routine drug bust would become a life-or-death struggle that would test the very limits of their unbreakable bond. The hunt was about to begin. "Units 15 and 18, we need you to circle around the north side of the preserve. Suspect is moving deeper into the swamp," Sarah radioed, her eyes never leaving Marcus Williams as he stumbled through the muddy water ahead. Max strained against his leash, every muscle coiled with anticipation. His breathing was controlled but eager, the way he always got when prey was in sight. Sarah had seen this look thousands of times. It was the look of a predator who knew victory was within reach. Williams suddenly changed direction, abandoning the shallow water for a narrow strip of solid ground that led deeper into the cypress grove. Sarah cursed under her breath. He was heading for the most dangerous part of the preserve, where the water was deeper and the wildlife more aggressive. "Max, heel!" she commanded. But as they approached a fallen log blocking their path, Williams made a desperate move. The suspect grabbed something from his backpack, a small cloth bag that Sarah immediately recognized as containing drugs, and hurled it in a high arc over the water. It landed with a splash in a dense cluster of cattails roughly 30 yards to their right. Max's head snapped toward the sound, his nostrils flaring. The scent trail he'd been following was now contaminated with the strong odor of the thrown narcotics. His training kicked in automatically. When drugs were detected, his primary mission was to locate and alert. "No, Max! Stay on target!" Sarah shouted, but it was too late. The Malinois had already made his decision. With a powerful leap, he launched himself over the fallen log and splashed into the murky water, swimming with determined strokes toward the area where the drugs had landed. His GPS tracker beeped frantically on Sarah's radio as he moved further away from her position. "Damn it!" Sarah tried to follow, but the log was too high and the water too deep. By the time she found a way around, Max had already disappeared into the thick vegetation. Williams took advantage of the chaos, crashing through the underbrush in the opposite direction. Sarah faced an impossible choice: pursue the suspect or follow her partner into dangerous territory. "Unit 23, what's your status?" came the radio call. "My K9 is separated, tracking evidence in the eastern section. I'm pursuing the suspect on foot," Sarah responded, her voice tight with concern. She could hear Max's movements through the cattails, accompanied by his excited barking as he located the thrown drugs. But the sounds were getting fainter, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that her partner was moving deeper into an area marked on all their maps as high danger, alligator habitat. Meanwhile, Max had indeed found the drugs, but his training demanded more than just discovery. He needed to alert his handler, and Sarah was nowhere to be seen. The intelligent dog lifted his head, listening for her voice, but heard only the sounds of the swamp, the splash of water, the rustle of vegetation, and something else that made his ears flatten against his head, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Sarah lost sight of Williams as he vanished into a maze of cypress knees and hanging moss. She stopped, breathing hard, and made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Max, come!" she called out, her voice echoing across the water. The response she got wasn't the familiar sound of her partner crashing through the underbrush toward her. Instead, she heard something that made her blood run cold. Max's bark had changed from excited to urgent, almost frantic. She keyed her radio with shaking fingers. "Dispatch, I need backup at my location immediately. My K9 is in distress." "Copy that. Unit 23. Units 15 and 18 are en route to your position." Sarah abandoned her pursuit of Williams and began fighting her way through the marsh toward Max's last known location. The water grew deeper with each step, and the wildlife sounds around her seemed to intensify. She could hear Max's barking growing more desperate, but she couldn't see him through the dense vegetation. When she finally reached a small clearing where she could see across the water, her heart stopped. Max was standing on a small island of solid ground, no bigger than a picnic table, completely surrounded by dark water. But he wasn't alone. 15 pairs of reptilian eyes reflected the morning sunlight as they slowly circled the tiny island where her partner stood, trapped. Sarah's radio crackled. "Unit 23, we have your position. Are you okay?" She couldn't answer. She could only watch in horror as the crocodiles began closing in on Max, who stood perfectly still, his training the only thing keeping him from panicking as death approached from all sides. Sarah's hands trembled as she raised her binoculars, the full horror of the situation crystallizing before her eyes. Max stood motionless on the small patch of muddy ground, his body rigid with training and instinct. The 15 crocodiles moved with prehistoric patience, their powerful tails creating ripples in the dark water as they slowly tightened their circle. "Jesus Christ!" whispered Officer Martinez from Unit 15 as he arrived beside Sarah. "How the hell did he get out there?" "Following the drugs Williams threw," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. "He was just doing his job." The largest crocodile, easily 12 feet long, had positioned itself directly between Max and the shore. Its massive head barely broke the surface, but Sarah could see the intelligence in its ancient eyes. These weren't mindless predators. They were calculating, patient hunters who had cornered their prey. Max's training kicked in. He couldn't retreat, so he did what he'd been taught. He held his ground and waited for his handler's command. But Sarah was 70 yards away across treacherous water, and any sound she made might trigger the attack. "We need to create a distraction," Officer Johnson from Unit 18 suggested, unholstering his weapon. "I can put some rounds in the water, maybe scare them off." "No!" Sarah grabbed his arm. "Gunfire will either make them scatter, taking Max with them, or it'll trigger a feeding frenzy. Either way, he's dead." The radio crackled. "All units be advised that Fish and Wildlife is en route with specialized equipment. ETA 15 minutes. "We don't have 15 minutes, Sarah muttered, watching as one of the smaller crocodiles began edging closer to Max's island. The dog's ears flattened against his head, but he remained perfectly still. Max's mind raced through his training. He knew Sarah was nearby. He could catch her scent on the wind, but he also understood that these creatures represented a threat unlike anything he'd faced before. His muscles coiled with tension, ready to spring into action the moment an opportunity presented itself. The largest crocodile suddenly moved, its massive body surging forward through the water. Max's head snapped toward the movement, and for a terrifying moment Sarah thought the attack had begun, but the reptile stopped just short of the island, its tail slapping the water in what appeared to be a test of the dog's resolve. Max didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, positioning himself to face the largest threat while keeping the others in his peripheral vision. It was a tactical move that would have made his trainers proud, but Sarah knew it was only buying time. "There!" Martinez pointed to a fallen cypress tree that extended partway into the water. "If we can get to that tree, we might be able to get close enough to help." Sarah was already moving, her boots splashing through the shallow water at the swamp's edge. The tree was old and massive, its trunk creating a natural bridge that extended about 30 feet into the lagoon. But even from the end of the tree, Max's island was still 40 feet away. As Sarah climbed onto the slippery bark, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The crocodiles weren't just randomly surrounding Max, they were working together, communicating through subtle body language and positioning. This was a coordinated hunt. "Max, stay!" she called out, hoping her voice would reach him without startling the reptiles. The sound of her voice caused Max's tail to twitch, the first sign of emotion he'd shown since being trapped. But he remained in position, his training overriding his desperate desire to swim toward his handler. One of the crocodiles, emboldened by the dog's stillness, began pulling itself partially onto the island. Its claws dug into the muddy bank as it tested Max's reaction. The dog's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, but he didn't move. Sarah's radio buzzed with updates from dispatch, but she ignored it. Her entire world had narrowed to the small island where her partner stood surrounded by death. 6 years of partnership, thousands of hours of training, countless successful operations. None of it mattered if she lost Max to these ancient predators. The crocodile on the island opened its massive jaws, revealing rows of teeth designed for crushing bone. Max's training told him to hold his position, but his instincts screamed at him to move. The conflict between training and survival created a tension that Sarah could see in every line of his body. "Come on, boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Just hold on a little longer." But as she watched, more crocodiles began moving toward the island, their patience finally exhausted. The hunt was about to begin, and Sarah knew that no amount of training could save Max from what was coming next. The largest crocodile's tail slapped the water twice, a signal Sarah had read about but never seen. It was the sound that told the others the waiting was over. The tail slap echoed across the water like a gunshot, and Sarah watched in horror as the coordinated attack began. The largest crocodile lunged forward, its massive jaws snapping shut just inches from Max's front paws. The dog leaped backward, his hind legs slipping on the muddy edge of the tiny island. "That's it," Sarah snarled, pulling off her tactical vest. "I'm not watching my partner die." "Collins, don't!" Martinez grabbed her arm. "Protocol says we wait for fish and wildlife. You go in there, you're both dead." Sarah shook him off with a violence that surprised them both. "Protocol doesn't account for family," she snapped, kicking off her boots. "Max would dive into hell for me. I'm not doing any less for him." On the island, Max had found his rhythm. As one crocodile attacked from the left, he danced to the right, using his superior speed and agility to stay just out of reach. But the island was shrinking with each movement, and Sarah could see her partner was tiring. Without another word, Sarah dove into the murky water. The shock of the cold hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to swim toward the fallen cypress tree. Behind her, she could hear Martinez screaming into his radio for immediate backup, but his voice faded as she focused on reaching Max. The water was deeper than she'd expected, and the current stronger. Ancient logs and debris created hidden obstacles that threatened to trap her underwater. But Sarah pressed on, driven by a desperation that transcended rational thought. Max caught sight of his handler swimming toward him and let out a bark that was part joy, part warning. 3 crocodiles immediately turned toward this new threat, their prehistoric brains calculating whether Sarah represented prey or predator. Sarah's training kicked in as she reached the submerged portion of the cypress tree. She pulled herself along its trunk, using the bark for grip while keeping her legs moving to avoid presenting a stationary target. The water around her churned with the movement of massive reptilian bodies. "Max, hold position!" she shouted, her voice carrying across the water despite her exhaustion. The largest crocodile had to make a choice: continue stalking the dog or investigate the human who had entered its territory. For a moment that felt like eternity, it remained motionless, weighing its options. Max used the distraction to his advantage. With a powerful leap, he launched himself from the island toward a partially submerged log that was closer to Sarah's position. He landed with a splash, his claws scrambling for purchase on the slippery surface. The movement triggered chaos. Several crocodiles converged on Max's new position, while others turned toward Sarah. The water erupted in a frenzy of thrashing tails and snapping jaws. Sarah reached the end of the cypress tree and found herself still 20 feet from Max. Between them, 4 crocodiles had formed a living barrier, their bodies creating a wall of scales and teeth. She could see Max on his log, soaking wet but alive, his intelligent eyes locked on hers. "Trust me, boy," she whispered, then took the deepest breath of her life. Sarah dove beneath the surface, using her police training to navigate the murky water. She swam hard and fast, staying close to the bottom where the crocodiles couldn't easily maneuver. The water was so dark, she could barely see her own hands, but she knew Max's approximate position. Above her, she could hear the muffled sounds of the reptiles thrashing at the surface, confused by her sudden disappearance. Her lungs burned, but she kept swimming, guided by instinct and desperation. When she finally surfaced, she was directly beneath Max's log. The dog's wet muzzle appeared above her, and she could see the relief in his eyes, but they weren't safe yet. The crocodiles were regrouping, and their temporary confusion was wearing off. "Max, down!" Sarah commanded. Without hesitation, the Malinois dove into the water beside her. Together, they began swimming toward shore, Sarah's arm around Max's chest to help him stay afloat. Behind them, the crocodiles gave chase, but the shallow water near the bank forced them to slow down. Martinez and Johnson were waiting at the water's edge, their weapons drawn and ready. As Sarah and Max stumbled onto solid ground, the officers provided covering fire, sending the crocodiles retreating into deeper water. Sarah collapsed onto the muddy bank, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Max immediately pressed against her side, his wet fur matting against her soaked uniform. They were both alive, both safe, and the bond between them felt stronger than ever. "You crazy, beautiful bastard," she whispered into Max's ear, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it." But their celebration was cut short by the sound of Martinez's radio. "All units, be advised that suspect Marcus Williams has been spotted fleeing on foot, approximately half a mile north of your position." Sarah looked at Max, who was already getting to his feet, his body language shifting back into work mode, despite everything they'd just endured. She smiled and reached for her spare radio. "Unit 23 to dispatch," she said, her voice steady once again. "We're back in pursuit." Water dripped from Sarah's soaked uniform as she and Max emerged from the swamp, but neither showed any signs of slowing down. The near-death experience had only sharpened their focus, turning them into a hunting machine driven by absolute trust and shared purpose. "Williams is moving north toward Highway 82, came the radio update. "Units are setting up a perimeter, but he's got a significant head start." Sarah looked down at Max, who was already sniffing the air with renewed intensity. His tactical harness was waterlogged but intact, and the GPS tracker continued to blink steadily. More importantly, his eyes held that familiar gleam of determination that told her he was ready to finish what they'd started. "What do you think, partner?" she asked, checking her weapon to ensure no water had compromised its function. "One more track?" Max's response was immediate, a single sharp bark that needed no translation. They had unfinished business. The terrain beyond the swamp was different, but no less challenging. Dense pine forest stretched toward the highway, crisscrossed with deer trails and logging roads that provided countless escape routes for a fugitive who knew the area. But Williams had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the bond between a canine officer and her partner. Sarah adjusted Max's harness and gave him the command he'd been waiting for. "Track." The Malinois dropped his nose to the ground and immediately picked up Williams's scent trail. The suspect had been running hard, leaving behind a clear path of broken vegetation and disturbed earth. Max followed it with renewed energy, his experience in the swamp having only strengthened his resolve. They moved through the forest with practiced efficiency, Sarah reading Max's body language like a roadmap. When his ears perked forward, she knew they were gaining ground. When his pace quickened, she prepared for contact. 6 years of partnership had created a communication system that transcended words. "Unit 23, what's your position?" Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. "Following a hot trail northwest of the preserve. We're closing fast," Sarah replied, her breathing steady despite the pace Max was setting. 20 minutes into the pursuit, Max suddenly stopped and raised his head, his nostrils flaring. Sarah immediately halted, trusting his senses completely. Through the trees ahead, she could hear the sound of someone crashing through underbrush. Williams was close, and he was panicking. "Easy, boy," Sarah whispered, drawing her weapon. "Let's finish this right." They moved forward with tactical precision, Max slightly ahead, but constantly checking back for Sarah's signals. The forest opened into a small clearing where a creek created a natural bottleneck. Williams would have to cross here, and they'd be waiting. Sure enough, Marcus Williams stumbled into the clearing 30 seconds later, his white tank top torn and his face scratched from thorns. He was carrying a large duffel bag and checking over his shoulder constantly, clearly unaware that his pursuers were already in position. "Atlanta Police! Stop right there!" Sarah shouted, stepping into view with her weapon raised. Williams spun around, his eyes wide with desperation. For a moment, he seemed to consider surrendering. Then his gaze fell on Max, and something shifted in his expression. "That's the dog from the swamp," he said, backing toward the creek. "You risked your life for a damn animal." "That animal," Sarah replied, her voice deadly calm, "is worth more than a dozen scumbags like you." Williams reached into his jacket, and Sarah tensed. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small plastic baggie filled with white powder. "You want your drugs so bad?" he snarled, raising the bag above his head. Come and get them! He hurled the baggie into the creek, where it landed with a splash in the fast-moving water. It was a desperate attempt to destroy evidence, but Williams had forgotten one crucial detail about canine units. Sarah smiled. "Max, retrieve." Without hesitation, the Malinois plunged into the creek. His powerful swimming stroke carried him to the baggie in seconds, and he returned to shore with the evidence held gently in his mouth, exactly as he'd been trained to do. William's face went pale as he realized his mistake. With the evidence secured and his position compromised, he had nowhere left to run. "Marcus Williams, you're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute, fleeing and eluding and reckless endangerment," Sarah announced, pulling out her handcuffs. As she secured the prisoner, Sarah couldn't help but notice how Max positioned himself between her and Williams. Still protective, still vigilant, even after everything they'd been through. The events in the swamp had tested their partnership in ways she'd never imagined, but they'd emerged stronger than ever. Back at the station 3 hours later, Sarah sat in the locker room toweling off Max's fur while the veterinarian finished his examination. "He's in perfect health," Doc Peterson announced, patting Max's head affectionately. "Whatever happened out there, this boy handled it like the professional he is." Sarah looked into Max's dark eyes, seeing not just her partner, but her family, her protector, her friend. The crocodiles had been terrifying, but the real revelation had been the depth of trust between them, a bond that could overcome any obstacle. "Ready to go home, partner?" she asked. Max's tail wagged once, and Sarah knew that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they'd face them together. Some bonds couldn't be broken, no matter what tried to tear them apart.